Hello and welcome to another session of the Crypto Club and Digital Asset Weekly Catch-up on Zoom. It's Sunday, the 4th of May, 2025, and as is always the case, never quite know what we're going to be talking about. Subjects usually include Bitcoin, blockchain, crypto, DeFi, ICOs, STOs, NFTs, the metaverse, central bank digital currencies, and whatever else comes up. Really depends upon the audience. Hope you enjoy the session. Do remember to click on the like, subscribe, even better, come along to a future event. With that, let's see who's going to join us and what we're going to talk about today. Annie, good afternoon to you. Welcome back.
Hello, good evening.
Hey, welcome aboard. And Guido?
Hi, Gary. Nice to meet you.
And you, welcome aboard. Have you come along for a particular reason or interest or anything?
Yeah, just to learn more about, my background is more sort of traditional technology and finance.
Okay.
And I'm really interested to understand what the view is on sort of how kind of digital finance is going to, interconnect with technology, especially when it comes down to kind of exchange and currency creation. Those, in my view, are kind of the most pressing needs. As I said, my background is more into Internet of Things, but not with blockchain-based security.
Okay. It's interesting. One of the projects I was involved in a while ago was exactly around Internet of Things and actually securing the endpoints using blockchain.
Mm.
So effectively, you had every endpoint would have a hash, so a cryptographic hash for its representation,
Mhm.
and its identity and the hash would be stored on the blockchain. And we were using that to make sure that the software on the devices hadn't been compromised in any way,
Mhm.
and that they were registered and approved devices as well. So quite an interesting exercise.
Great.
So all interesting stuff. Well, you're also joined by Annie, who's something of a growing evangelist in the whole crypto and AI and whatever else space these days. And Stuart, who's joining us, I'm guessing from California this morning.
From California this week, yes.
Excellent. Welcome back, Stuart, as well. So yeah, we usually get a real mix of people who are, some weeks they're into crypto, some weeks they're into blockchain, some weeks they're into the metaverse, and then occasionally we talk about central bank digital currencies, which are not actually crypto, but people mix them up anyway. So, well, welcome, Guido. Well, anytime you got any questions or any ideas or anything that you'd like to share, just fire away. Annie's usually really good as well at providing some interesting questions, and Stuart's really good at answering them. So between us, we can cope. I don't know, anyone seen anything in the news or anything to share at the moment? It was Token 2049 in Dubai last week. That usually kicks out a load of stuff. I know a few people who sometimes join us on this call were at that, so they're probably flying home after having a great weekend. And there's been a few other events around as well. There's a big event in London on Monday, I think it was, but I haven't had any feedback from anyone yet. So the floor's open. What's going on in the crypto and blockchain world, Stuart? How's your project coming along?
I walked away from it about 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
I can't say why because my lawyer has advised me not to say anything.
Fair enough. We'll leave it there then. But that means
Yeah.
that you're now presumably exploring other areas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. Very good.
Yeah, I've got a couple of other things that are going.
Okay. That's good. Annie, well, you've been to any interesting events or anything of late that you could share?
Well, I've been in a blockchain course, let's put it that way. So this coming week would be the final week, so I've been learning a lot. I'm kind of curious, I suppose, probably the person who used to answer all these questions probably not going to answer it again. I think the curiosity is if different people prefer different way of doing blockchain,
Hmm.
and then you have you can't just say that everything is completely just confined to to where, your territory is. I mean, for
Mm.
example, if some people prefer NatWest Bank and other people prefer Barclays, those banks can't just say, we do our own things.
Yeah.
If you're a customer of NatWest, then sorry, we can't, we can't quite, I mean, it's the same thing, isn't it, with blockchains? You need to be able to communicate with each other, whichever supplier you have chosen to do. I mean,
Not
example,
really. No,
for example, like BlackRock would say, "Oh, we don't use any supplier. We develop our own blockchain, right?"
Mhm.
And and then there are other suppliers out there who are doing blockchain or whatever.
So it's interesting. It really depends on the purpose that you're doing it. So there've been a number of projects where they're effectively standalone blockchains, particularly in supply chain. Now, in supply chain, I can certainly talk about a couple of projects that were going on with. There's one with Maersk Shipping that was happening, which was tracking containers and vessels, which has kind of died away now. In
It
some
failed.
ways,
It failed, Gary.
yeah. But
Let's be honest about it.
But my understanding from the failure was it was twofold, or possibly threefold. One was the cost of participating, which made it quite restrictive. The other thing as well is that if you're in a competitive industry, you don't necessarily want to start operating on a competitor's platform. And so there was an aversion for other shippers and that to join that. And I think there were a few other issues as well that I won't go into on here.
Yeah, it was IBM. The whole thing is, and I'll probably get into trouble for saying this, but IBM, when it goes into newer technology, tends to mess it up. It, I've helped IBM out many times with the 360, the 370, Signaling System 7, LU 6.2. Every time they get into something, they go in thinking it's great. The salesmen oversell it. The customers believe IBM, and it ends up very unhappy.
I think there's certainly some of that. And the project, I remember overall, it was running on Hyperledger Fabric, which is actually an open source platform as part of the Linux Foundation these days, I think.
Correct.
But it was,
Yes.
but it was heavily supported by a lot of IBM development who contributed to it. But they
Right.
also, I think, were heavily involved in the overall project as well. And I think that's where some of the challenges may have arisen. And the other thing as well is that it all comes down to it's a real challenge if you're operating a platform in supply chain where you need all of the participants to be on that same network. And I think that's a bit of an issue as well. So you can't have it with just a few of the port authorities being on it and one of the shippers and a few of the operators. You really do need the entire kind of industry, ideally, which I think ties in a little bit with what you're saying, Annie. But this is where it does show, though, you don't need to have interoperability between blockchains. You may need interoperability on the blockchain.
Interoperability is usually via a layer 2, which is the blockchains at the moment are in the stage of very first. It's like an AOL, and there's many better ways of doing blockchains than currently out there. That's for sure.
I'd still describe the whole blockchain space and how it evolves to be rather like aviation. And you may have heard my analogy before now that, in 1903, the Wright brothers flew this little biplane 100 feet or whatever it was. It wasn't very far. And then, that was successful. And they thought, oh, well, this is the future. Meanwhile, there were probably people already saying, that's never going to go across the ocean.
That's never going to fly, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So they make it a bit bigger and they stick an extra engine on and it crashes, and that results in a couple of deaths, that kind of thing, which means the government gets involved, the police get involved, the authorities get involved. And then you have more regulation to protect people around that. And then the next airplane is another innovation and it flies. This time it might have engines in a different place or whatever, and it flies great. And everyone goes, "Oh, that's super." And then people keep innovating, and there's another crash, and there's more regulation. The government gets increasingly interested, and we're kind of going through that at the moment in some ways. I think where some governments are going, we're not touching this with a barge pole because it's very risky, whilst others are going, oh yes, let's get into this space. So
Did you see the
Stuart,
You're on mute.
sorry,
You just-
sorry,
yeah.
sorry, I'm
Did I-
unmuted.
did
It's
we
just
see-
flashing at me. Did you see the paper put out by the EU on blockchain? They obviously don't understand decentralization.
what a
And it's
recent
kind
one.
Yeah, it was in April, asking
Okay.
for comments by the end of April,
Okay,
and then they want to make it law.
because there was the EU blockchain observatory, which has been running for several years, and
Yeah.
they were doing some stuff and some exploration that. So I don't know.
Yeah,
Presumably
I
they've
had the
issued
lawyers
something.
sent it to me. Yeah.
Okay.
And basically, they don't understand decentralization because GDPR requires that you remove sensitive information if you're asked. Well, the problem is that once you're on the blockchain, it's immutable.
Yep.
And
I've had
it's
this exact
outside of the
conversation.
EU. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's outside of the EU. So is it FU or EU?
Well, it's certainly something. Again, having been in the space since on the blockchain side, certainly since 2016.
Yeah, tell me you're old now. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me I'm old without saying I'm old, but yeah, it certainly are. I mean, the crypto space I got interested in 2014, the blockchain space 2016. So I quickly learned things like people were saying, "Oh, GDPR and blockchain are not compatible." It's actually that's false. If you construct it correctly and you architect it right, there's not an issue. If you do something silly like put personal data directly on a blockchain, then you're absolutely right. You've got a real problem, particularly when you've got the GDPR right of deletion, where you can request your information to be removed, and you can't delete off a blockchain. Absolutely, but there are ways around.
Not unless you're South Korea.
Well, or in the early days of Ethereum, where you roll it back and redo
That's right.
it. Exactly. But yeah, there are ways around it though, where you actually use the blockchain as a register, and the register then goes somewhere else, and that somewhere else is editable in some ways. So I've seen some good ways of overcoming those issues. But yeah, it's not perfect. And again, I think all of this is going to keep evolving, and people are going to try things. There's going to be the accidents. There's going to be the crashes. There's going to be the lawyers getting involved. There's going to be more regulation. And hopefully in time it'll settle down and people will start actually looking at what the value proposition is. The kind of so what is how I describe it. Annie, does that go in some way to answering what you're asking? Or did we just drift off there?
No, I think so. And also it does then create a follow-up question. So you were saying that for supply chain, it tends to be the amount of cost. But then if they go into the blockchain, it also meant that they don't need to have a separate thing that they call digital transformation, whatever it is that they would have done if it is not blockchain, to try to track where the goods have gone, from, the end of the factory into the ship somewhere, and then it's in transit in the ship, and then it arrives at the destination. So, if they weren't in the blockchain, they would have to be in some sort of a digital thing that they can track all these things, right?
Yeah.
So isn't that then the cost of that then goes into the blockchain? Is that not how it should have worked? Then it wouldn't be. It's more expensive. Why is it more expensive?
I don't know around the costs, but an example I can think of was Walmart, where Walmart adopted a blockchain technology solution for their supply chain, and it was to track and trace green goods. So basically, things that grow. And they did an initial prototype on mango production, and it was interesting. I remember having conversations with some of the team originally around that, and they were saying how it was that if you went into a Walmart store, or as it was in the UK at the time, Asda, and you went to a mango that was on display in the fruit section, and said, right, where did this mango come from? If you then attempted using their current technologies, it took about 2 weeks, I think it was, to work its way back to figure out where it come from. And so they then adopted a blockchain solution. They did it as part of this, and they had that answer in seconds. So they could say, right, this mango, here's a QR code or a barcode on it, or whatever. We just scan that in, and we can trace the entire lineage of where it came from, right the way back to which farm we acquired it from and what date and that. So it has those benefits, but you're right, there are costs as well, because in order to do that, that now means you need some sort of mechanism to capture that data at the farm. You then need the support of the truck company who take it from the farm for them to have a tracking mechanism, then for the distributor to support it, then for the shipper to enable it, and everything. So again, it comes back to you really need all the participants in it. The advantage I found with working with companies like Walmart, though, is that they are so huge, you don't have a choice. If you want to remain as part of the network, if they tell you to adopt something, then you accommodate it accordingly. So we've been joined by FM and Duran as well. You folks want to say hi and see if I got your names wrong? There we
Hello.
go. Hey there.
I'm Dauren. Yes.
Oh,
Hi.
Duran. I wasn't that far wrong then. Whereabouts are you based, Duran, then?
Cambridge.
Okay.
Yeah.
It seems to be something of a hub in the innovation space, definitely. So
Yeah. I'm in crypto since 2013, I would say.
okay.
Back in 2014, I had a crypto startup which was called Coins Friendly. We came up with an app which was actually tracing transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain.
Mm-hmm.
And we basically came up with a mechanism to predict the fluctuations of Bitcoin price, but it was way too early in those days, and the adoption was not there. So I did go to many conferences, spoke with people like Brian Armstrong and Brock Pierce, and the whales of Bitcoin blockchain world. But yeah, so I moved on. I'm now the co-founder of a neurotech startup, which is called Brain Patch.
Okay.
So yeah, something else entirely. But
is there a blockchain or crypto connection there somewhere?
Only insofar that we actually started this company during the ICO craze back in 2017, 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought that this would be a crypto company, but no, it's just a normal venture capital, no crypto involved. Just kind of DNA wise, we're connected, but only in spirit. No blockchain connect.
Well, it's one of those things that I still believe that over time, as the blockchain technologies mature, I think we will see revisiting of some things where you may now be able to say, actually, now it works the way you need it. Well, thanks for joining. It was really interesting. And FM, are you going to come off mute, FM?
Hi, everyone.
It's not FM, it's JT. Is that right?
That's right.
So JT's gone anonymous and has switched identities into FM now. That just confuses everybody. Sorry, for the benefit of those who aren't new on here.
I should have stayed quiet, right?
Yeah, that would have been interesting. Yeah. For the benefit of the others on the call as well. Jason, he's
one of us,
a regular.
one of us here is probably the real Satoshi Nakamoto, right?
It might be several of us.
Once you know that that's the case.
I was hoping we might have got someone on the call today to find out what was discussed in Dubai last week. In that case, anything else you've been hearing? Anything else going on? Yeah, go on, JT. Anything else you've heard or of interesting? You always come up with some
just
great
I'm
insights.
reading today that Coinbase is sitting on a huge amount of Bitcoin at the moment. If I remember, I read this earlier in the morning. I think it was 2.5 million Bitcoins or something like that. It's just crazy.
And that wasn't holding it for clients type things.
Most probably it's a mix, It's not theirs, I think,
Yeah.
It's just an enormous amount of Bitcoin.
That's interesting. I'll see if I can dig out the news item then while we're chatting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Coinbase, yes. They have lots.
Yeah, Coinbase quietly holds 2.7 million Bitcoin under management. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll pull a news item up at the moment. That's kind of interesting. Because that's the kind of thing that could have an influence on the market as well with that kind of volume. So they're just saying, that they're holding it under management, which is kind of curious because if you're holding it under management, that's effectively a mixture of a custodial service and a management company, isn't it? Which I think that's the fascinating thing as well, that there is a lot of visionaries in this space. It's just that the vision hasn't yet been delivered in some ways. But certainly the adoption since the early 2000s, as you say, like 2014 in particular onwards, definitely there's been a massive growth. And a mixture of that is real people actually adopting it, plus companies now getting into it. We've got this latest wave, as was mentioned before, BlackRock and Grayscale, that kind of thing, all buying into it. And you've got ETFs and this kind of thing. But a lot of the actual wallets are still wallets with very little content in them. But it's still a wallet, it's still use type thing. Guido, in terms of your perspective, you said before you come from the traditional finance side of things, and you're looking at what's going in the crypto space and that kind of thing. Is that right? The way you're describing it?
Well, more also traditional technology side of things. I mean, I always thought that it was blockchain was a relatively inefficient way of securing things from an energy perspective. So I was always, right, I've always had my skepticism with respect to the need for but at the same time, as I said, if you look at IoT, distributed trust is something which we need, right? If we need to empower a distributed world, the question is how to bridge it, and that's from a scale and legitimacy, and from their trust perspective.
Mm-hmm. I think that there are several blockchains that have evolved, and I know Stuart's looked at various blockchains in the past where, things like Solana and Cardano are much more efficient, much faster transactions, this kind of thing. And it's interesting as well, a while ago, I remember laughing, I watched a social media influencer who had just heard about crypto, and he was saying he was never going to use Bitcoin because it was consuming all this electricity, blah, blah, blah. And you looked at his studio setup, and he had all of these lights up all around him and everything. It's like, your YouTube channel is probably consuming more electricity than Bitcoin is, and you're going down that route. So, interesting, different perspective. So come on then, what else is happening? Annie, any more interesting things?
No, I mean, if you want to talk about, the Bitcoin bed, because you were distracted, but there were new people joining, or you answered my question earlier. So I would say, yes, I think I get the point when you say, Walmart being, a huge organization, if they ask for certain things, their supply chain would comply.
Mhm.
I would also think that even if they're not using blockchain, let's say they're not using blockchain, let's say they use some other things. Those other things still require the tracking all the way from the farm and whichever point as well, it doesn't matter. So I think my point is if the strategy for the supply chain is that they can track that thing from the origin. In this case, it was the farm, but it can be something else. It can be a cocoa plantation or something,
Mhm.
if it's chocolate, right? Or coffee bean, if it is coffee. So the point is that, whichever method they're trying to do this, whether it is blockchain or something else, if they have to track it all the way from the source all the way through to the supermarket, then I just thought I can't see why it is more expensive for it to be in the blockchain than
Mhm.
it is if it is something else. So I was just kind of curious as to whether is it because when it is not done at all, they don't have that clear path visibility, right?
Mhm.
But when they're doing it in blockchain, they have because, like what you say, they have to track all the way. But ideally, even if they don't do it on blockchain, they probably have to track it all the way anyway. But they
Mhm.
weren't doing it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure whether that cost narrative about it being in the blockchain is more expensive is actually true.
I think it used to be, and again, this comes back to the evolution, a bit like the airplanes again. We stick another engine on, it becomes more efficient, and that. Um, in that, in the earlier days, where the only real blockchain in use that was well known was Bitcoin blockchain, and that was known because of proof of work and the consensus mechanism, using lots of computers, lots of compute power, and then as Guido says, was using a lot of energy in that. That probably was true then, but then you had other blockchains that came along that maybe they use proof of stake as a methodology, which is much lower cost of securing the integrity of the platform and having consensus. Um, some of the blockchains allow you to process transactions at far lower cost. So you're right that now it shouldn't be a cost differentiator, but probably when it was tried first time round, it probably was. And this is the thing that each time I see blockchain projects, it's almost as though the project is just a little bit too far ahead of the current state of the technology to properly enable it. And this is where every few years, I find it fascinating that you see, I keep seeing, for example, a lot of real estate projects, and I know Stuart's got an interest in real world assets and the tokenization of that. But the particular area that I used to look at was about tokenization of property and looking at it for real estate. And one of the first projects on that was in Honduras, I think it was, where they actually put they put property, effectively the legal title and property ownership on a blockchain. And the idea was to then track and trace the ownership of the land and the properties and that, which was a great idea, good technology, wrong country to do it in, because at that point, certainly, it was having a lot of political challenges, shall we say. But the concept of, let's stick all properties onto a blockchain and we'll use that as a central ledger we can all refer to. Having bought and sold several properties in the UK, anything that makes that process faster, easier, and cheaper, you think, wow, yeah, I'm in on that. But then it becomes a problem not with the technology, but with the existing processes. So you think about how if you want to stick property on a blockchain, that means you're going to have to get in the UK, for example, land registry to put all of their data, which they're quite protective about because they generate money from it, onto a ledger in some way. So that's where you start hitting different issues, and it's not actually the the blockchain that's the challenge. But in order for it to work, you would need all of the properties on the blockchain. And that's where, unless you get a national support for something, that's just not going to happen. And I think there are some innovations in the Middle East now, looking around there. And people will often talk about Estonia as well. So Estonia was one of the early ones where they had the e-registry scheme, which is actually about putting citizens on a blockchain and then putting the property on a blockchain, which was quite interesting because they were doing it for a totally different reason. And it was ultimately because they wanted an immutable record of citizens and ownership and various other things in the event of a particular situation, which I used to describe it as the neighbours coming to visit for the weekend. And if geographically you understand where Estonia is, you'll kind of understand that a bit. But the neighbours come for a barbecue at the weekend, they bring their tanks and they don't leave. And they stick around for quite a few years. And this kind of thing has happened in parts of Eastern Europe and further east than that. And so the original thinking for Estonia was it provided the means that once the neighbours eventually left, presumably because there was no more stuff on the barbecue to have, and they took their tanks and everything home, you've still got a list of who owns what and that. Because in Germany, I believe there's still a real problem of understanding, tracing back property ownership, because a lot of records don't exist anymore, particularly in the likes of Berlin, where because of World War II, everything destroyed in there. And so you still get situations where people will buy a property in Germany, I believe, and then a while later someone will come back and say, actually, that's mine. I own that 80 years ago or whatever, and they haven't got the records. So from that fundamental thing, you really need a clean sheet of paper of building up a land registry and a title deed type thing. And that will probably happen somewhere, I know the Middle East has certainly done explorations on it, and that might be a possibility. But then we go down to the whole thing where people say, oh yeah, we're going to buy and sell properties on the blockchain. If you do that in the wrong way, that breaks all sorts of laws. So again, going back to the UK, there is a limit on how many people can have legal title on a property. And I can't remember what the number is, but it's relatively low. So say it's 8 or 10 or whatever. Well, this idea of we're going to tokenize the property ownership and we're going to slice it up and you can resell your tokens and all this kind of thing. If you can only have 8 owners, then if you do it all directly, that's not going to work. So this is where what you then do, you create what's called a special purpose vehicle. So it's like an intermediary company. That company actually owns the property, and you have what are effectively shares in that special purpose vehicle, which works its way around that. But in the early days, some people were trying to put properties directly on a blockchain, slice it up, and have the slice effectively the property on the blockchain. And that fell foul of a lot of regulation and that, and wasn't very attractive. Now people put this kind of like intermediary layer, and that's more viable. So again, I've seen about, I think it's probably about up to 70 tokenization of real estate projects now that started a bit like, as Dora mentioned earlier, in the ICO craze. There were a lot of them where there were ICOs spinning up for property, and then they fizzled away. So I've seen a lot of them fail, and it's good that there are a few where companies like TPX, which Stuart will be very much aware of, the team there are actually spending a lot of time thinking this through and actually working with regulators, working with whoever it takes to actually get a good proposition in place.
So it's not quite decentralized, isn't it? It's trying to be decentralized, and then it kind of becomes centralized when you have somebody owning, the bit of it, and then you have to then, if you can't afford the portion that is possible, then you have to go to this intermediary, which is kind of centralized.
Yeah. The whole decentralization thing I find interesting, because People have been using the fact that a blockchain is decentralized and distributed, and that quite often they use the terms interoperably, which is completely wrong. The decentralization is of the governance of the blockchain. Okay, the distribution is the fact that the computers are split all over the place, and so it's the governance of effectively the management which is decentralized, not necessarily everything else, depending upon how you design it. Stuart, you've been in the space for quite some time. Your thoughts on that?
We'll go back to Annie's question about understanding cost. I think a lot of that is fluff, where people have made assumptions. They've looked at, incredibly expensive transactions on Ethereum, and said, oh, it's just so expensive. But the point is, if you're running your own blockchain, or you have an enclave in someone's blockchain, so you're not actually paying for a transaction, there's other ways of charging it, then I think that's gone away. And that shows me a lot of people don't understand blockchain and enclaves. But from a manufacturer point of view, let's say Annie makes, let's say you've got a rubber plantation in Malaysia, and you're supplying 3 or 4 different companies with rubber, and your factory is, taking it from the trees all the way through to the flat pieces of rubber that are shipped. You may be dealing with 2, 3 different companies, and for one company to say you've got to do it this way, that does increase your cost, because now as the end producer, you've now got to have 3 different systems, presumably. Whereas before you could just write it on a piece of paper or deal with a letter of credit, things like that. So it's a different way of working. And what a lot of people forget is that there's labor-intense processes at the very end of the supply chain that don't readily convert into electronic bits and pieces. And I see this a lot in Silicon Valley, where people design something and they're used to 1 gigabit internet speed. And they suddenly, you say, well, if I'm in Malaysia or if I'm in Sarawak or somewhere like that, I may be lucky to get 110 bits per second. And they look at you with a blank stare and they don't understand it. It's like, doesn't everywhere have fiber? No. And so you've got to look at some of these systems that are designed and see whether they're really practical at the far end of the supply chain.
I think Stuart's nailed it on that. The other thing to consider as well, it's funny you choose rubber, because supply chains operate differently and tracking them operate differently depending upon the product. And the one thing that I find fascinating is people who try to set up a supply chain to track liquid products. So at least a physical product. If you're in the pharmaceutical industry or something, you've got all your raw materials, they're all powder based or whatever, but you can track and trace them. If it's a liquid, how would you know a particular part of a liquid is part of a particular, traceability thing? That's another challenge in its own right. And if I remember correctly with rubber, when it actually comes out of the trees, it's in a liquid state. And then you do stuff to it to galvanize it or rubberize it or vulcanize it or whatever the right term is, whereupon it becomes a physical state. And you got this
Solid
thing
state, yes.
Yeah, and that's where it actually makes it quite difficult up until then to go to the absolute source, because whereas with a mango, a mango remains kind of immutable and you can track and trace it.
Yeah, but you don't know who picked it. All you can trace it down to is the farm. And if you want to trace it down to the picker, which field on the farm and things like that, that's where it becomes impractical.
Yeah, but this is where it's interesting, come back to the whole IoT piece, that if you look at how a lot of agriculture is being automated, So actually, if you've got an automated robot that's doing the picking, it's pretty easy to stick a little chip in it to track the fact that it was that robot that picked it. But this is where it comes back to the other thing as well, that sometimes as technologists, we come up with these amazing ideas. Oh, well, you can trace this right the way back to the field it was grown in and blah, blah, blah. You consumer, all they want to know is it ethical, first of all? Was it grown somewhere that didn't involve sweatshops, that wasn't illegal? The government's only interested in terms of, did it go through somewhere which has got sanctions against it, and it's not used as an illegal operation or whatever. But the whole concept of being able to trace right the way back to a field is fascinating. But where's the value? Is there any point in it? A few people might want to be able to do that. It used to be quite nice.
Where they want to track that is because they get outbreaks of various diseases that are carried with the fruit or with the produce, and so they want to trace it back to the farm. But they don't necessarily need to go back to the field because farmers actually farm in a regular manner rather than irregular.
And in fact, again, and Stuart's not that far from a particular other fruit that is grown, which companies have tried to track and trace, which is the Californian wine industry. And the concept of tracking right the way back to grapes is a fascinating thing, because that's where it does get relevant again, because you do want to know which vineyard it came from and which south-facing slope of a morning it was and all this kind of thing. So
no, the wine, the biggest problem with wine is when you ship it out of California, you have to have licenses, and licenses involve taxation. But yes, obviously, if you go back and look at which vineyard it came from, the vineyards don't necessarily, when they're making wine, they will use a vat of wine from someone else, and that may be a mixture of 15 different suppliers, and it's an incredibly complex situation to look into. I don't want to know anything about it.
It's something that unfortunately I know an awful lot about, because I used to work for the world's largest wine manufacturer.
Well,
That's
I
right.
don't know.
Who was that, Stuart? Who was that, Gary? Who did you work for?
Ernest and Giulio Gallo.
All right. Okay,
So they are the world's largest wine producer.
Yeah, but from our perspective, I'm still involved in the wine industry, and we are very keen on using blockchain technology. Not so much for track and tracing everything, but to give people a greater sense of authenticity about what we're promoting. So we are definitely doing that. I've got a little project at the moment which is quite granular, coming from a very specific part of a vineyard, and the whole way through we're photographing the project. Of course, people have to trust you at the end. That there's an element there. If they don't trust you, well, that's no good. But we are showing people every step along the way. And not mixing 15 wines in a vat, by the way.
I want to say something about this, because look, what people want is to drink wine. Okay, it's been going for centuries. They don't give a shit if it came from a specific section on a farm.
No, some of them do.
Some people do, but that's like a very small minority.
Yes.
Okay?
It's a high price wine. It's a high price wine. Probably you're not used to drinking it, JT.
My father was my grandfather was a very big wine producer, so I know quite a bit about that. Okay, so the fact is, all of this stuff, is just really to show, hey, we're applying technology, which is okay. I don't like it when people come and then, especially the big wineries, and say, oh, we're doing all of this so you know where it's coming from. People say, I don't give a shit. Where's my glass of wine? Where's my bottle at a price that I can afford? People with money don't give a shit because, hey, I just want a good wine. Yeah. So if the price is high, they are gonna trust on the brand that they know, and that's usually brands or a specific year that they buy of the specific brand. The rest, I mean, it's I find it funny. All the traceability, guy, we've been talking about this traceability for how many years already? in blockchain?
JT, I think the reality, because I know quite a bit about the wine sector, is that you're right. There's effectively two markets. There's the low cost, consistent quality space, which is what Gallo's got a great reputation for. The quality is not brilliant, but it's consistent. So every time you open a bottle of Gallo wine, if it's a Chardonnay, it will taste exactly like the previous bottle. So you get consistency. But there is also the fine wine market. And this is where you start looking at vintages, vineyards, this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And it's much, much smaller space. But nonetheless, there is definitely a demand for that. But Nathan, as you join us, be great. Actually, could you quickly introduce yourself? Tell us a bit more about yourself as well, because I think this is the first time you've joined us, isn't it? I know we've interacted online before now.
Yes. But... Sorry. Okay. And I'm sorry about the background. I'm in Miami. It's bright outside. So my name is Nathan Wax. And if you spell my name correctly and you're interested to know more, there's only one of me in the world, W-A-K-S. So I'm a cellist by profession, long-term cellist, but I'm also been involved in the wine business for a very long time as well. 2 brands in Australia, one called Killicanoon, which Jancis Robinson just wrote a very, very important article on Friday. So if you want to know more, right now there's the whole history of Killicanoon that she contacted me the other day to get some stuff on. So and she's one of the greatest wine writers in the world, as you probably know, you guys that are in the business. And the other one is called Seppeltsfield. And we're definitely doing, Seppeltsfield is one of Australia's oldest wineries. And that's where we are doing blockchain. I'm also doing some art and other things on chain. And the reason I'm doing things on chain is because of, yes, is it JT? I see FM up here. I'm sorry, I can see you're saying JT, but FM.
He's just trying to confuse us this week.
Frequency modulation stations, yes. I used to run one. But in fact, we are dealing with high-end collectibles, and I'm not interested in low-end stuff. That's for people who want to do exactly what Gallo and others do. We want stuff where people actually know. We want to share as much information as possible in an immutable, authentic, transparent way. And the blockchain is the best way to do that, as far as I can see. So I'll give you an example of one of the projects not launched yet, but we will be launching. Seppeltsfield makes Australia's most expensive wine. Most people don't know that, but it's a port. We don't call it port in Australia, but it's a vintage dated tawny called Colheita in Portugal, for anyone who's nerdish enough. And we have every single vintage going back to 1878. I'll repeat that. Every single vintage. No one else has anything like that in the world. Now, we sell that at a ridiculously high price, but now we're going to put a portion of that on on blockchain, meaning that people can buy X number of milliliters whilst it's still in barrel, and they never have to take it out of the barrel, but they can know that it's absolutely authenticated because it's going to be audited. It's secured by Seppeltsfield, insured by Seppeltsfield. And yes, when they take it, Stuart, it'll get taxed, but not until they get it. So they can trade it as often as they like with no tax. They can make money from it or keep it and watch it grow in age and complexity and value, and then maybe drink it one day. That's a perfect, for me, use of the technology.
And that's something I know in Europe, there's a lot of investment clubs around en primeur wine.
Correct.
So that's effectively exactly as you say, where it stays in the VAT, and so there's no tax paid on it.
And not just that, we don't want it to be. I'd actually not that keen on some of these investment clubs because they reside in trust. It's a bit like financial advisors. Yep. I've never used one because I'm always concerned about conflicts of interest, and they abound, as they would and as they do in the wine business. So we're saying to people, look, you're dealing here directly with the producer. Obviously, we'll be the intermediate, but it'll only be a transaction fee. This is the story. The story will be told in Seppeltsfield's own words, very powerfully, immutably, and as long as you trust Seppeltsfield, and King Charles was there 10 years ago and had a good time, you will probably be happier to buy the wine direct in this manner and then not even have to take possession of it if you're not ready to drink it.
I think
on
it's
an
a great
individual
example.
basis, not as part of a club. You don't have to join with anybody else, and you don't have to wait for somebody else, as some of these other places do, to say, "Oh well, give us your money. We'll make you a lot of money, but we'll decide when to sell the wine." And half the time, it doesn't make any money, and then you've lost your money. So you make an individual decision.
So there you go, Annie. There's a real opportunity of potentially using a blockchain and enjoying sampling the product as well.
Yeah, that's
We've got
also
another one.
bad way.
Actually,
There's
Go on.
also very bad ways to use blockchain. You guys saw Sam Altman yesterday, I think, or the day before yesterday, about the World Coin. They're just gonna drop 7,500 of those orbs across the US, part of the US, to scan again people's eyes. It's just insane.
I thought they hit issues with that around the legality and the personal information and that kind of thing. You're saying they're relaunching that, and
Yes, in the US now, because until now they were afraid to do it in the US, but now I guess the guy is closer to Trump. It has no fear. If they're gonna launch it there, that's
Okay.
crazy stuff.
Because that's interesting for those who don't know around this WorldCoin initiative. From what I remember, is that they launched a scheme whereby they had this I guess it's a retina scanner or something,
Yeah.
which they used to get a unique signature of who you were, tied that in with your identity, and in return for which you were paid in some world tokens. So it's kind of like an ICO in a way, but not for a fundraise, but for an information gathering exercise. Because what it suddenly meant was that the team had a massive database of personal information about individuals and a form of identifying them, that kind of thing, which once you've got something like that you can use for authentication and identification, is very powerful in its own right, particularly when you can start linking it to other data. So yeah, that was an interesting one, but it did kind of hit the rocks a bit, I thought, that people started realizing actually you're sacrificing your personal identity for a couple of tokens or whatever, for which you didn't know they were worth anything. So yeah, interesting. We'll have to keep an eye out on that one there.
Yeah, that's very, very bad, But anyway.
Yeah. So we've got 2 minutes left before we close the call, because I like to close these kind of on time. So I'm going to quickly open the.
There's one thing that I wanted to mention. In Arizona, in the US, they voted for, I think it was to add.
They're accepting Bitcoin for payments, weren't
To buy
10% strategic reserve.
Yeah, but the governor just blocked it today. Yesterday.
Oh.
So she blocked it. The Arizona governor, it's blocked it. Veto. She always has the veto in Arizona. So she did it, and everybody's furious there at the moment. It just shows the politicians. Certain politicians are really out of touch, man.
That's fascinating as well, because Arizona State University, if I remember correctly, is one of the universities with an actual crypto, what would you describe, faculty type thing, which I think was set up for a benefactor donated quite a lot of money, and it was one of the first major universities to introduce a blockchain faculty, if I remember correctly.
Interesting is that the day before, Strategy announced they are going to buy $84 billion of Bitcoin. Billion, not million, 84 billion. So it just shows, two completely views contrast. One saying, I'm going to buy all of this Bitcoin, and then a governor, she vetoes what was voted. Yeah, it's just insane.
Sure. Okay,
but it's
folks,
happening.
Yeah. It's and again, it shows how these things kind of evolve over time. Folks, we're going to have to close the call off. As is always the case, we end up getting to a really interesting conversation, and I have to shut us down. So I'll just close as always by thanking everyone who's taken part. Thanks for joining, Guido. I hope you found some value in that, and we didn't go too deep down the rabbit hole. And Stuart, JT, Annie, thanks as always. for your contributions. And Nathan, thanks for joining us, and look forward to learning more about some alternative wine in Australia too. And folks, have a great day. Nice chat with you all. See you soon again. Bye.
May the
Bye.
4th be
Bye.
with you.